So thank you very much. I have to again. There is
No,
a.
it's started.
I
Yeah.
think it started. Yeah. So thank you very much, Alex,
Mhm.
for being here. I'm really honored to talk to you, and I have some very introductory note about you. There's Alex Taek-Gwang Lee.
Yeah.
Is professor of British and American Cultural Studies at Kyung Hee University, Seoul. It's still
Yeah.
so, yeah?
Yeah. I'm living in Seoul and
Mhm.
teaching in Seoul. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
But actually,
And
my hometown is the Busan is
it's
from south.
Busan, right, right, you told me, yeah, yeah. And Alex has written extensively on French and German philosophy and its non-Western reception, Korean cinema, popular culture, art, and politics. He has lectured and published widely in South Korea and beyond. He co-edited the book The Idea of Communism 3 with Slavoj Žižek, 2016. And his book, if I'm not mistaken, The Rise and Decline of Radicalism in the Post-War World Order is forthcoming. Is it true?
Yeah, actually, the title is just slightly changed. The Red
Okay.
Deleuze, and then the gonna be the title gonna be a Red Deleuze,
Mhm.
and the philosophy and the third world.
All
Yeah,
right. Okay.
yeah.
So, Alex, it's for me, it's not an interview. It's more a matter of curiosity. I mean, it's not an interview in the traditional sense, but rather a set of reflections, propositions, and questions. I've newly read two articles by you, and I try to focus on them accordingly, but also generally. The first question that is very interesting for me, especially you being engaged with like Western philosophers, like contemporary philosophers, or let's say even like postmodern philosophers, post-structuralist philosophers. The first question for me, which interests me most, is a general question of, I mean, why is the reception of Western philosophy in Asia or in non-West or in South Korea important to you? I mean, don't you think that translating them simply, I mean, translating the Western philosophers simply suffices?
Thank you. Actually, thank you for your invitation. And then, all right, if you allow me answer that indirectly. In Asia in general, not only South Korea, and North Korea, but also other Asian country, the Western philosophy marked some kind of the liberal arts. You know, is a kind of regarded as kind of core of education.
Mhm.
So the since the actually the early modernization in particular actually Japan, the
Mhm.
Meiji, actually their revolution happened,
Mhm.
and then such a modern revolution actually forced the people to be educated,
Mm,
and then they actually sent lots of reporter or some investigator to Europe, and then they actually came back to the Asia, and then they actually reported that their king and the emperor in those days,
mm,
and then we actually look around Europe, and then actually the education seemed quite important because actually they look around the Europe, and then they found out that such a the advanced and developed the economic system
mm,
and the political system, and then those intellectuals, and then those actually the politicians think about what kind of things they must do if they
mm, mm,
follow chasing their kind
mm,
of European development or advancement.
mm,
So they decided we must educate people. So that's why that was actually the first stance, actually the statesman or some ruler of the state, that means that the government try to educate their people, because in those days the urgent task for them is to educate or to produce the people,
mhm,
you know
mhm,
is a problem with that kind of the previous regime,
mhm,
so what they need is a modern workers,
mhm,
working
mhm,
class,
mhm,
and they try to transform the farmer, the peasant, to workers,
mhm,
and then that is actually reason why they try to educate people, and then they actually brought uh, fr- the from actually that European country was philosophy.
Mhm,
In
mhm,
those days, actually, in my opinion, that philosophy might be political science, the what we actually call today, the
mhm,
political science. And then as you know, that actually the political science established it, and then another people, they're quite interested in language, and then that is a kind of tradition of Asia. They're quite interested in liberal arts and humanities.
mhm,
So and then following that the political philosophy, and then another metaphysical, actually the idea,
mhm,
the came into the this context. That's what
mhm,
I'm thinking. So in the one thing is actually you need to know is about this, the combination. That means modernization and the philosophy in Asia. Definitely, government, the made this, the all policy about, the philosophy education. This is very interesting actually situation. So that's why just this actual idea brought me to this, curiosity of the why the Korean people and why Asian people quite passionate in studying philosophy. I think you would
okay.
find out that not really actually the other student who came to the the Germany for studying philosophy, except Asian student in the Japanese and the Korean, or some I don't know actually how many actually Chinese students came there, but anyway, just in Korea for a while, after the Second World War, the lots of the student came to the Germany for
Mhm,
studying philosophy, not the economy, not not economics, not politics. What they tried to study was philosophy. So many actually the
mhm,
students went
mhm, mhm,
came to Germany for studying philosophy, because philosophy in those days meaning something, is about life, and then the enlightenment, if you want to be the proper human being, you need
mhm,
to know actually philosophy. That was very interesting situation, a kind of symbolic moment,
mhm,
about this. And then I already actually wrote this thing is in that the Foucault and Iran, my article. And then also the kind of Heidegger and the many the anti Western the attitude, the tendency of this that kind of Western philosophy is definitely came up to and persuade a lot of young students in Asia. And then I think
mhm,
actually the um there might be some kind of rhetorical interaction, you know the sort of actually Heidegger, for instance, and then some
definitely.
kind of postmodern, the philosophy.
Mhm,
That
mhm,
means, kind of reflection, about
mhm,
or some
mhm,
the critique of Western civilization as such.
mhm,
And then that would resonate with that, the Asian, mind. They
mhm.
try to
Yeah.
find out the
Mhm,
alternative to the current system, you know, and then they don't. I don't think actually the early Asian intellectual wanna be just a European. What they want is bring in alternative regime to actually the sublimating both regime, the European, and then the actually the Asian. They don't want to actually be a European simply, you know in early age, but you know that's why just they try to find out alternative within that the philosophical discourse. That's what I'm thinking.
mhm. Um, it's very interesting. I mean, it's what springs to my mind while you were
Mhm.
talking about like Korean or Japanese intellectuals going to West and study, or
Mhm.
like even what you told me about the time of Tony Blair, that like some
Yeah, yeah.
some students were sent there, like from Korea, to go to England and study. What's interesting for me, there is somehow analogous with some um, uh, the first decade after the revolution in Iran, a lot of Iranian intellectuals were sent to Western universities. But
Hmm.
that is a bit ambiguous for me, because I mean, some of them came back to Iran with a sort of appreciation of enlightenment, like appreciation of like Western culture. And on the other hand, some of them, or let's say even most of them, they came back with a kind of ressentiment, a kind of full-fledged ressentiment, or even anger about West and Westification,
Yeah,
as you
yeah.
you, you call it in your article from Al Ahmad. Um, Actually, I mean, it's it's very, I don't know, I'm a bit curious about the fact, because I mean, we will deal with that in the question of Iran, but I see it is somehow, you know, there is somehow some analogy with what happened in Iran after revolution, you know, like uh, because there was some expectation, like the government says, or the state says, okay, we send you there, you go there, you're more equipped theoretically, and you can come back and defend us, and you can come back and even like strengthen our ideology, which is very ambiguous situation. I try to talk about it later to you, but but Alex, what is again? What's my question is that then what is the role of these, like, let's say, contemporary French German philosophers? Then what is the role of these, like, let's say, I mean, through post-structuralism? What I mean, like, the reception of these philosophers? Because I mean, like, in the sense that Walter Benjamin, for example, talks about translation. I mean, translation is a way of thinking, you know, like thinking through translation. Then what is the need of contextualizing that? You know, what's the need of speculating or even thinking about, like, the reception of Western philosophy in Asia? What is the need for that?
So if you allow me my own, periodization of the history of European philosophy, actually before, First World War, I think after the, First World War, everything changed. The European people, they really believe that the power of the region, is Kantian, presupposition. Even Hegel criticized Kant, but definitely he anyway to some point succeeded, in the revising Kantian, the presupposition. And then, actually the since the Descartes and then, the Hume and then Kant is definitely actually the point, the European philosophy in those days try to make is definitely the meaning of objectivity. How do we actually, the understand objectivity, something like that. It's a very actually rely on Newtonian actual physics. But after Second World War, everything changed, and then I think that thing is happening in terms of fascism and the communism. Within the the European system, the communism and the fascism both actually the I think the kind of result of that sort of skepticism is nihilism. The Nietzsche already criticized. Of course, in the fascism and then communism try to to overcome this nihilism. But of course, communism try to do in terms of internationalism. They try to find out the rest of the world outside of Europe. Fascism is definitely try to find out alternative within themselves. That is nationalism. That is actually the nation, something like that. So, but the through that devastated situation of a Second World War, they conflicted. I think they kind of Armageddon. They actually the European two European power, the conflict, and then meet in the terms of the warfare is in Deleuzian sense kind of war machine. Actually the wiped up the all civilized the achievement, and then suddenly they actually find out the the problem of reason, the such an enlightenment, actually the paradigm, if you like, this paradigm, the colonized the whole globe, and then Karl Marx already pointed out in the Capital, this kind of, the expansion of capitalism means, the reproduction of bourgeois mirror image across the world, But actually, in those days, they believed that this is a white man's burden, as Kipling's poem described. The we are European already achieved this actual civilization. We must dispute. We must contribute the development of humanity, something like that. Was their agenda. But actually, they found out that such hideous the reality after Second World War. So I think that is exactly the meaning of the post-war philosophy. And then, in my opinion, the post-structuralism, what I call is might be I prefer the post-war French philosophy. I prefer that is that there is no post-structuralism in my opinion, because they never rejected structuralism anyway. So anyway, just so the post-war French the philosophy actually concentrate on this topic. Of course, Heidegger was there. Even Heidegger supported the Nazi, but it's not like Heidegger was a demon, and not like that. Heidegger found out problem of European the paradigm, and then rationalism. He tried to the also the bring in kind of alternative to the European civilization. That's why he actually the criticized West Western industrialism, and he actually rejected Eurocentrism, but he didn't find out the exit. That's why only thing he can do is definitely supporting Hitler, something like that. In those days, he believed this. Hitler is a kind of leader of their nation, leading that kind of Europe, from the that hell to heaven, whatever called it, is kind of alternative. He believed that, but he also disillusioned by Nazi's reality, and then gradually separate himself from that political the side. But anyway, so I think actually what the post-war French philosopher found in such a Heideggerian critique of European the legacy is definitely, in my opinion, try to find out the alternative method to rationalism. That means the region-centered paradigm. What was that? They try to bring in the art or something, the alternative to that one, and then actually there's actually, in my opinion, that might be called the non-representative the philosophy, or some, if you like, in the they quite interested in the the unrepresented, or in Deleuzian sense is nonsense, not a sense, and then Benjamin is in this sense quite precursor, very precursor, because Benjamin was very actually he's actually the how can I say, just Weber is his work's not really coherent, right? But he actually scattered his idea about the kind of reflection on the European rationalism, and then he actually made lots of the alternative idea within his own incoherent the fragments. But there was actually the very the shocking the moment within actually the kind of European the discourse, in my opinion. So reading actually the Benjamin, you would find out is the one of the last pieces he actually made before he's committed suicide. And then you would know that actually the kind of on the concept of history, all right? And then he actually talk about the Angelus Novus, and then the Jetite. That means the now the how can I say, just Jetite means a kind of now here. If you translate in English, it might be the right now is a kind of right here. But it doesn't mean a kind of the geographical or some physical sense of the time. It's sort of very the eternal time, kind of the is a Jetite means there's some sort of unrepresented moment of history. That is a kind of a pure difference in Deleuzian sense, pure difference, which can make that kind of break,
Right.
the between previous regime and the future regime. So what he talk about is Jetite is not really actually the concept of time about the present, but rather concept of future. That's what I'm thinking. So this is, in my opinion, dominant idea. We can find it reading any the text which was produced by the kind of post-war French philosophy. Is almost everywhere. Derrida, the Deleuze and Guattari, even Foucault. Foucault in the political spirituality. What is this? Definitely, is a political spirituality against that kind of political philosophy. All right. So even actually political philosophy is sort of, as you know, there is the Thomas Hobbes idea is a liberal, the according to Foucault is a liberal theory of governance. That is the theory between governance and the population. That is actually political philosophy, and then there's a very rational agenda. how to about how to produce people, how to actually make the state, is a commonwealth in Hobbesian sense. But actually these the idea, that means the rational idea about state in Deleuzian it might be called Urstaat or Urstaat is failed. The second, the two actually the World War is a proof that. So, and then they actually find out how can solve this problem of Urstaat. That means how can be a problem of this nation state, in my term. And then that is a post-war French philosophy. And then my actual presupposition is that's why actually they were quite interested. That means the post-war philosopher quite interested in non-European country. Foucault is quite interested in Iran. Most of Taek-Gwang, actually the philosopher, new philosopher, interested in the China, and then the Deleuze is quite interested in the other the third world, and then the Latin America, in the Guattari quite interested in Latin America, and then that's why just they believe that the world is already already actually unified. That means many actually the people still believe that there is the gap between advanced society, advanced Europe, and then the underdeveloping or developing the non-European country. But these the post-war French philosopher already discovered that without this the developing non-European country, there wouldn't have been actually the kind of European, advanced European, the country. So they made that world is one, and then they actually saw that this whole actual world as a kind of the uneven, uneven actual system. That's why they criticize that, and then they bring in the new actually idea of internationalism or new idea of the mondialization is kind of the create a new world. In my opinion, they might be called the third world in Deleuzian sense. Deleuze said we must invent the third world. Third world is not a geographical reason. We must invent the third world. That means that's quite powerful. That's why just this idea, this reading brought me the current interest in the research.
Alex, that brings me to the next question. Actually, interestingly enough, talking about third world. I mean, I read an article written by you, Deleuze and the Third World, and I mean, I read something apart from Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, who say, and the states of the center, each of them has not only an external third world, but there are internal third worlds that rise up within them and work them from the inside. The more the worldwide axiomatic installs high industry and highly industrialized agriculture at the periphery, provisionally reserving for the center the so-called post-industrial activities like automation, electronics, information technologies, and consequences of space over armament. The more it installs peripheral zones of underdevelopment inside the center, internal third worlds, internal souths, masses of the population are abandoned to erratic work through subcontracting, temporary work, or work in the underground. I think Deleuze explicit, I mean, on the other hand, I would say that Deleuze has an explicit, let's say, rejection of metaphor in his work. I mean, which is tied for me to the whole rejection of the signifier in Deleuze and Guattari. The opposition then becomes Guattarian machinic versus Lacanian metaphoric for me. Yet the third world as is connected to the world systemic economic division as periphery countries, dominated by the countries comprising the economic core, can be read metaphoric in Deleuze. I mean, I read that article and it was really, I mean, as you told me, I mean, according to Deleuze, third world is something to be invented. But don't you think it is a bit metaphorical talking about third world in this sense? I mean, third place is not only language, it's also a territory. That's my question.
Yeah, actually, good question. I think one you suggest to me is general reading of Deleuzian concept third word. But actually, you should know that the Deleuze quite overtly repeated that concept. And this is concept. Actually, the concept is very important in Deleuzian terminology because it was influenced by Caballé, and Althusser as well. Because Althusser and Caballé, they criticize the phenomenology and then formalism. That means the formalism means actually the linguistic formalism, and they actually criticize those the very mainstream the philosophical tendency in 1950 and after the Second World War. And then Caballé and actually the made the concept of concept that we need to actually we need to make the concept rather than the analysis, not rather than the another actually idea, something like that. What they said is definitely is we need to the actually the bringing kind of concept of object, that is not actually experience. The concept is quite different. It's kind of synthetic, approach to the object. So how to understand object was very important, actually, the issue after the Second World War, the French philosophy, But that's why just when Deleuze used that the term concept, it was very serious, actually the use of the, the philosophical, terminology. So it's not a simple metaphor. Is the concept, the term as such is actually made against that such a rhetorical the term metaphor or some metonymy and sort of that. He actually used that concept in philosophical sense. That means the scientific sense. And then we need actually to approach this concept of third world in different perspective, not like literary one. When he said okay, just the third word is how to invent the third word. He said we need to invent the third word zone, of the language. What does that mean? Actually, according to actually the Deleuze is language, and then he used actually this term language quite in a broader sense. It means, in my opinion, media. And then these days we might be more familiar with this term, the media rather than language. But in those days, actually, Deleuze used the language in terms of, in my opinion, is a media in general. So, so that means actually we need to, invent a new language. What does that mean? New language. That means you must actually, the escape from the media in general. That means the logical media. You must get out of that kind of logical media because media is a kind of technology, all right? So technology, and then so in kind of Bernard in the Stigler, he talked about categorization of a technological categorization. That is a rationalization as well. Rationalization. Your experience is the role of media and the role of technology, and then algorithm. Is kind of AI, artificial intelligence. All this technology or big data, all is about what? How to rationalize, how to actually make your experience predictable. All right. But as we know that actually the Deleuze and the Guattari resist this prediction, data, predictable data, they resist that. So in their own, term, the language is such a, role, very similar to actually today's big data, literature and everything, European literature, everything is about that kind of big data. So what they said in terms of inventing third word means, you must invent actually a new language about this, the world. There's a big, that means it doesn't mean you must reject the technology as such. It doesn't mean that. What they know that they are not actually the metaphysician, what they believe that we cannot escape from this, material condition because we already part of this, material world. That is actually what Kant, discovered, we cannot escape from this world, except you die, otherwise you cannot escape. So as far as you live, you must stay within this system. And then how can we actually change this world? Because it already includes us. That means okay, just like Indian, the mystics, like the Krishnamurti and something like that, the meditative actually the idea, they would persuade that you must change yourself, and then world will be changed. Okay, just it's possible, but thing is that how can you change yourself? What does that mean? You change yourself, and according to Deleuze, you must invent a new language. That is actually my opinion. So when they said territory and then the third world, okay, to some point it would be actually it would embrace that that geographical sense of that kind of the territory, that kind of the sense of the geographical sense of language. That means a dialectic something. But what actually Deleuze the emphasize is that how can we make the actual difference of language, and then it doesn't mean we can make some difference of language. He already said these actually the language already embraced actually contain the kind of difference within its own logic. What is that? Pronunciation. This is actually the where Deleuze meets the Derrida. So even actually we use the same language, but we got a dialect. Okay, and I got an accent. I don't change my accent, like American, not like the British. I'm a Korean English. I'm using Korean English. This is a foreign language and the alien language, and this alien language, according to Deleuze, is a third zone. Third actually the word zone of the language. That means third zone language. That's why he said, the minor literature, by the quoting Kafka. Kafka is definitely such a writer. He wrote his work in foreign language. He has no mother tongue. He was between. He actually born into Bohemian Republic, but when he grown up, the Bohemian Republic disappeared. He lost his mother tongue, and he wrote actually his work in German. But he's actually the family is Jewish. There's a very actually that is a third word. So when the Deleuze said third word or some third word zone of the language, that means that you must be an alien, you must be a foreigners. What actually Socrates taught. The philosophy belonged to the foreigners, not actually local. And then so you speak English, your pronunciation cannot be actually changed, and then your actual accent made yourself recognized by other people. That's what actually Deleuze said. So even you write down some language, but that accent is still the preserved, that kind of linguistic structure. That's what he said. There's a possibility of a minor literature. So when he said the third word, it's not the peripheral, it's not the marginal, something. According to Deleuze, that actually the third word is what? Many words. Many words is a multiple possibility of the world. That means it doesn't mean European actually the paradigm of the world is quite simple. Globalization. What does that mean? It's a standardization. They made every kind of metropolitan city same. Just like today's, the what is the effect of globalization? You can travel everywhere without any inconvenience. You got the credit card. Even these days, you don't need a credit card. Simply using a PayPal or something like that. And then you actually using a same hotel system. Using actually the same restaurant. Franchise. You don't have any kind of inconvenience. That is actually the age of tourism before this pandemic. And then what actually the today's system in the middle of pandemic, what try to do is definitely restore that global, the mobility as such. That kind of that is exactly actually the Deleuze and Guattari and the other French philosopher criticize.
Interestingly, you were talking about like mobility, and I noticed that you've also written about global geopolitics, and there is also interestingly in Deleuze and Guattari this concept of geophilosophy. Yeah. How do you then relate it to Deleuze? I mean, you're talking about like the concrete actual global geopolitics, as you said, reducing whole inconveniences and like facilitating also this kind of like a standardized, homogenized, lifestyle. How do you see it in relation to this like geophilosophy in the laws?
So actually, the today's impossibility. What is today's impossibility? We need to actually question this one, and then my answer will be to today's impossibility is that you cannot be a local.
Mm.
The localities disappear, locality disappear, and then what is this locality? Is of course the differences. Actually, of course, the differences is there, but people ignore that. Try blinded actually against that locality. Locality means old fashioned or to some point is invisible. Locality means, and then or some very abnormal, something like that. They try to remove that kind of abnormality from their own normal life. What is this normal life? Is a global standard. That's what I'm thinking. So okay, just the global mobility. Okay, just I think, in my opinion, global mobility is about the freedom of the commodity, freedom of commodity. So if you wanna travel, across the borders, what you need is that such the qualification of your own, the quality. How can I say, just the commodification of your quality? It means what kind of qualification we need is you must prove that you are kind of commodity. As a person, as a human being, how can you prove you are commodity? Is labor power. You would actually prove I'm a efficient labor power. Otherwise, you turn into the Poland into what? Refugee. Refugee is such a things which has no right to travel. Is when Kant wrote the treatise on that kind of the permanent peace. His actual treatise about permanent peace, and then he actually raised such the condition for that kind of permanent peace is a right to travel freely. That is actually world cosmopolitan rights. Nowadays that the cosmopolitan rights is turned to be a kind of a tourist right of travel. But if you wanna travel freely, whatever as a commodity, what do you need? You need a passport. That means the law. Always the law follow you, and the law would allow you. Whether you can get into any border or not. So territory is already protected. By this kind of law. It's domestic law. Okay, that is actually the kind of that the symbol of that kind of law is definitely passport. So without the passport, you cannot travel, even though you are qualified as a commodity. So that is actually in my opinion the secret of global system. So if you don't have any such a right to travel, you're gonna be a refugee. Refugee is actually in between existence. You cannot
That's,
get in.
sorry to interrupt you, but that's a key term for me. I've been working with refugees since 2006 in Berlin, like different things. I mean, but then comes to me this question that, I mean, what is then your take after refugees? I mean, they were legally, in the end of the day, they were legally allowed to enter Germany, like, I mean, almost 1 million refugees. Then what's your take on that? Because again, they were like through the German law, they were accepted, they were embraced, they were welcome to come here. Like rather than freely traveling here, they were legalized. Yeah, they were allowed to enter here. And you see that now it is like 2021, and okay, some of them are settled. A lot of them, they are still living in containers. A lot of them living like the margins of Berlin, not really central. A lot of them, they can't speak German yet. I mean, after 5 years, they have problems to have a kind of let's say a kind of residence permit to stay here, you know, then what do you think of them? Do you think that, okay, the refugees are here, there now, and they are now
That is a kind of a selection process. Selection process, all right? So okay, they would allow, you know, but actually point is, my point is a little bit different. But anyway, just I try to explain first, and then this issue first, and then all right, just kind of selection process there, because refugee is like a raw material, okay, a labor power, but it has no actually the legally proved by a what nation state. Okay, that's why just this is actually, in my opinion, very ironic situation facing, you know, actually globalization. You know, many people, globalization would remove the border and something like that, but why do we still have such a borders? Because of this kind of a ironic, you know, the ironic situation of tension between globalization and nation state. All right, so actually the refugee is okay. This as a life is in you know the later capitalism, the you know the, of course it's capitalism, you know, the exploited, you know, the lived, you know, living, you know, the labor power. What does that mean? Is life, you know, life means actually living labor power. And then life can only, you know, actually produce what is a time, is a extra surplus labor time. That means working time, you know. What actually the capitalism try to exploit is your time, not really actually your own, you know, some muscle power, something like that. They try to exploit your time, you know. That means that they set up kind of schedule, and you must come to in the workplace, and every kind of sort of this assemblage, you know, the already, you know, set up by this kind of capitalist, you know, governance. But anyway, just that's why just you know, labor power is a kind of commodity. That means that they would, you know, hire them. That means that they would buy, you know, second labor power. That means that they would buy a such what is a voluntary moving machine, you know. They don't need actually a kind of energy battery, you know, for this. Simply hire them, they move, you know, the without any, you know, the supplement, and then they actually push them, you know, to work, you know, to spend their own, you know, time further intensively, something like that. So, but anyway, just this is the reason why they need ideology. What kind of ideology is a neoliberal ideology or something? You must manage your life, and then you must actually, you know, the make your, you know, the smart, you know, and then you need to actually develop yourself like, you know, the Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was a refugee, and then you must be, you know, the you can be actually the person like a Steve Jobs, you know, if you actually study hard, if you the work hard, if you are creative. That is exactly selection process. What I mean. That's why Germany, okay, needs, you know, labor power, but it's very cheap, you know, raw material there. They could actually hire them. They could actually buy them. But what I mean is that they need the law. You know, that means that they need kind of actual law by which they approved these actual labor power is, you know, what is very invaluable actually the, you know, the commodity. Otherwise, you know, is a what is that? Is a Hannah Arendt, you know, rightly points out what is that? Is a scum of the earth. Is a trash. But this trash must be recycled. But if you recycle this, actually abandon the commodity, you need what? The guardian of commodity, as Karl Marx said in Capital. What is this guardian? There's a law. So, and who made this law? This is my question. Okay, this is my conclusion. And then, what is that? Nation state. Nation state is the only, you know, political regime or polity, you know, in Platonic, you know, sense, the political machine, you know, we can use. That is okay. Nation state can decide whether which kind of commodity can come in or not. So in this way, local struggle, local protest, and then being a local is so important. We cannot actually, you know, the fight as you know, the international existence. You know, we can fight. We can find out our site within, you know, nation state only. Otherwise, meaningless. We cannot, we cannot go to, United Nations headquarters, solving protesting against the refugees. Something is impossible. They cannot solve out. Only, nation state can solve this one. So that's why actually local fighting is so important.
Yeah, that's very interesting for me, Alex's point. It's very interesting. Like the personal experience tells me what I've experienced sometimes in Berlin. Like you had this funny example of going in front of UN and just like protesting there. I mean, I see it sometimes. Like, I mean, something happens in this kind of international scale, and you see like people go to in front of the embassy and it start demonstrating. I mean, I appreciate that. I mean, be it any country, I appreciate that. But like on the other hand, they just this ignorance that okay, like I am doing my moral, like I'm protesting in front of the embassy.
Yeah.
And through this ignorance of like what is actually happening in this international geopolitics,
That's what I'm thinking.
I mean, it's like the reduction of
Yeah.
politics to morality, like okay, it's my.
That is another actually, the ideology, in my opinion, is what I call, kind of part of governmentality. Is a moral, actually the philosophy is a neo-moral philosophy, something like that. Is a kind of actually the Slavoj Žižek also criticized it, Starbucks, moral, politics, something, Starbucks ethics, is the fair trade, the kind of ideology is definitely the blind us, out from what's going on, actually in this world. So, if you spend, the money, $1 for the coffee, and then they will send you the, the glasses, something like that. Is about actually in Africa they don't need the glasses, but they lived, ethically, by doing that. So of course we could actually criticize the Hippocratic, but my idea is that okay, strategically you can do that, like Greta Thunberg, you can do that. You can use a yacht to the travel UN headquarters, the protesting. That is strategically possible, but not all actually the protester, not all people couldn't do that. What I mean actually, and then we need to actually the exact point, and we should attack. Why is that? It's domestic, politics is so important. We must fight, domestically, and then we must fight domestically, but not actually, such an agenda of a domestic country, but what international issue. That's in my opinion, this is exactly the meaning of multitude. Antonio Negri already actually made the militant. When he said multitude, it doesn't mean people. Is a militant. Militant is outcasted, outcasted people. Is in Deleuzian sense is people to come, missing people. The militant is no longer people. Of course, it look like a people, but no longer people. Is foreigners. In Socrates term, we must be foreigners. And how can we foreigners? That is my curiosity. How can we, how can we actually be that kind of foreigners within this nation state? How can we actually be out of this the joint? That's why I'm quite interested these days.
Alex, it brings me to the second part, or let's say, like the second part of the second paper actually I read from you. I was really taken aback. I was really surprised that you had this concept of political spirituality in terms of like Iran and Iranian revolution. I just, first of all, before going to my main question, I think it is better that you explain, please, what you mean by political spirituality, or what Foucault means actually by political spirituality.
Yeah, that is quite a controversial concept. All right, very controversial concept, and then a kind of excuse, and Foucault's enemy, one of them is Guy Sorman, and lots of right-wing, liberal, intellectual in France, attacked, the Foucault. And these days, another such a blackmail, the book published, by even a Burso. So Foucault was addicted by a drug, and then sort of that. But actually, I think then, okay, they would, criticize, Foucault, junkie, or, he's not proper, actually, he, not, the political philosopher, something like that. But it's okay. But thing is that we need to actually understand why Foucault, was very attracted by Iran. That is kind of, in my opinion, eventful moment. He didn't want to go to Iran, but he actually met, Khomeini, in Paris. Khomeini in those days in exile, in Paris. But that he was only, the Islamic leader, who supported, student movement. He's leftist, in those days. But he was there, and then he met Khomeini, and he discovered something different, from what actually Western media, demonized. He found out something. So he actually changed his plan and then go to the Tehran. And then he actually started actually the report. But of course, the French, any no, French, the journalists quite interested in the Foucault's, contribution. So only Italian, newspaper interesting. So he actually contributed, that, in my opinion, the monumental, the stuff, in history of European philosophy, in my opinion. I think parallel to, equivalent to the Benjamin's, fragments. So he made that one, and then when he actually okay, so lots of critique, that the Foucault's Iranian stuff is that the Foucault was too much actually impressed by what's happening in Tehran street. But there was, in my opinion, that kind of critique started wrong, the presupposition, because Foucault was in the middle of that kind of demonstration in France. He already familiar with that kind of street fighting. Do you know what I mean? Actually, it's not really actually the new one, for him, for his experience, but actually the many critics actually pointed out that he was too much impressed by, that, the preconcept, by the preconceptualized by that kind of Iranian, the reality, something like that. But actually, I don't agree, that kind of, the presupposition. And then he actually found out what? He found out actually those, people on the street had no fear. That was the point. Very affirmative, sentiment. He found out such an affirmative sentiment there. In those days, in Deleuze and Foucault tried to solve out the problem of negation. Okay, after Second World War, what was actually dominant? The French university was definitely is Marxism and Hegel as well. So actually they believed that is that kind of master-slave, dialectic, negation and the confliction, and then those things would, bring in kind of, the new actual world, new alternative, the alternative actual regime to the current situation. But they found out, the problem of Stalinism, and then after 68, they knew that that kind of dialectic cannot solve, anything. It actually simply reproduce, current regime. No, the new one come up by that kind of dialectic. That was their dilemma. But Foucault found out, in my opinion, the alternative, the practice there is which did not rely on the negation, but rely on affirmation. So, and what kind of affirmation he found out there? It's still mystery, but we need to actually dig in, what actually Foucault found out then. But I think his actually what he discovered is crystallizing in that concept, political spirituality. What is that? Of course, yes, that means sort of, you don't. It's not about the free will. So actually, what I wrote in my article about Foucault in Iran, definitely that is actually my interpretation of Foucauldian sense of political spirituality. Why is that? Okay, that is actually impossible combination. Politics is kind of the sort of human beings, the 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 conduction. It's like human beings, activity. But spirituality is belong to that kind of religious, the practice is very actually it seems a very the oxymoron. That that kind of the combination as such actually seem quite an oxymoron. But thing is that he actually found out how this oxymoron make sense. That's why what I'm thinking. So why is that? Iran, the Iranian people didn't reject democracy, didn't actually reject the European legacy as such. But even Heidegger thought we must reject it, we must reject European legacy, and then we need to create actually another glorious history. That is what actually Heidegger thought. But the Foucault found out in Iran, Iranian people didn't actually reject the European legacy, but rather they tried to what? They tried to solve limit of that kind of European legacy. The policy of European legacy. What was the policy of European legacy? You don't know that. Carl Schmitt already pointed out. He criticized, the Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes didn't give the solution to this one because liberal democracy always, the emptied that actually the crucial place within its own system. What was that? Decision maker. Liberal democracy hesitate or some emptied. They got some obsession. That is what the Carl Schmitt said is the reason why he criticized liberal democracy. That the liberal democracy has obsession to empty that the crucial point of decision maker. According to Carl Schmitt, I don't agree that Carl Schmitt, but Carl Schmitt points out this problem. Carl Schmitt, according to Carl Schmitt, this is actually the enemy, actually of the liberal democracy. So that's why he supported Hitler. Hitler must be, the decision maker, right decision maker. That is actually the reason why he criticized Hobbes. Hobbes actually emptied that place by actually relying on the science. Okay, it's a statistics, it's mathematics, but that is liberal democracy. But actually Foucault also knew that one. Knew actually problem with liberal democracy. But the Iranian revolution actually Iranian revolution reserved their kind of liberal democracy, and the attempt to solve this problem by what? The feeling that they didn't try to fill. They tried to fill out that emptied crucial point of decision maker, but they let the decision making to what? God is a absolute emptiness. This is so interesting. Actually, the structure is quite different from the Japan. Quite different from Japan. Japan is emperor is God, and the God was a decision maker. And then this system brought the Japanese to war. All right. A similar actual system is in North Korea. North Korea as well. That's why North Korea is actually the leader is like a godlike figure. It's a charismatic figure of politics. That is, I think, in my opinion, is the dilemma of the democracy in general. Democracy in general, not only as liberal democracy, but also democracy in general would have this kind of problem. Who actually decide that one? Who decide that one? But the Iranian revolution, according to Foucault, as far as I interpret his actual concept of political spirituality, let the kind of decision making to what? God's realm. So they would actually elect their own leader, president. But if actually that president did kind of corruption or some the involve their kind of policy, how can you solve or how can you actually correct this the secular regime, political regime? God will come up.
Yeah, that's true, Alex. But I mean, I have to add that just listening to the the generations after war in Iran. Like I was born like 3 months after the like waging of the war in Iran, or even the generation after me, or the new generation in Iran. You would be even like facing this criticism when we are talking to our parents, those who took part in the demonstrations in the revolution, that okay, even if, I mean, in your words, even if the revolution per se was an event, and it was like an affirmative event, it was like affirmation rather than negation, yeah? What came after revolution gradually started to be sort of negating, at least it is what you hear from a lot of people. Like, I mean, in the article you talk about like the reception of Heidegger, for example, in Iran. Yeah, I mean, like Tehran University, when you go there, Heidegger is perhaps the main philosopher who has been taught there. I mean, nobody teaches about Deleuze. Sometimes Foucault comes, yeah, but like it's more Heidegger, and like this, I mean, Fardid, like this Iranian philosopher who brought Heidegger to Iran, and with his own mystic interpretation of Heidegger. But what I'm going to ask is that this affirmation, this event, to a large extent, and for a lot of even left thinkers and intellectuals in Iran, has been a little romanticized from outside, because this event per se, even if this event was affirmation, what came after this event was negation. I mean, you see the way that the regime is treating young people now, or the demonstrations now, or even the Green Revolution in 2009. Yeah. So what is your take on that? I mean, do you think that what would we imagine? What could we imagine actually if Foucault was alive now?
Right. Exactly. You're right. You're right. Even actually the Russian Revolution, corrupted, and then, but actually now that we know why actually such a revolution, turn the kind of, in my opinion, nominalized, sort of, turn to be axiomatic, So as you know that it's once that thing kind of event happen, and then what actually follows that kind of event. That's I'm thinking about. I'm already told you kind of role of a nation state. So actually, of course, that Iranian revolution is a kind of universal event. But once that event settled down, what happened? Nation state, try to galvanize, that in terms of the Deleuze, it might be a distribution of sensation. That the nation state as a machine try to distribute that kind of actual sensation of a revolution, or some that kind of the sensation of the passion or something like that. They try to actually distribute that one. Why? By what? Is the state apparatuses, education, and then legal system, and then the culture, many actually every kind of the structure, the state apparatuses work on distributing this kind of sensation, and then that means distributing means kind of exploitation. That actually already presuppose that. I use the three terms in same level, distribution, exploitation, production. These are same. Is the so three words which actually indicate one same the monistic actually existence. So that is the nation state, in my opinion. So you must produce something, and then if you wanna produce something, you need to exploit other people or exploit nature. That was actually the question already raised by Marx and Engels in the German ideology. The what is the communism? If you actually remove this exploitation, how could you actually preserve this production? That was a big question. That is, in my opinion, question about the communism. How can we actually produce without exploitation? That's as in my question at the moment. So that's why I said, okay, just now we actually seeing what nation state only. There is no longer revolution, but Iran as nation state. That's why I agree when you said we could say, okay, Foucault might be hallucinated by that kind of revolutionary passion, but that is a way in which always revolution hallucinate other people. We cannot blame revolution, because revolution is like an event which come up without our free will, right?
Definitely,
So
definitely.
that thing happened, and we try to interpret that one. But of course, it's not only us, but nation state. Also, what is captured, captured those that kind of revolutionary passion for its own development. So now I'm actually interesting is definitely how to solve this problem nation state. That's why I just turn to a communism. Communism. What is communism? Communism is only thought, only idea, which actually insists nation state must be gone. All right. So communism is actually something the always presuppose that kind of world beyond the nation state. So we need to actually this kind of idea of communism. So I think actually why the as you said is such a Iranian revolution. Okay, just it started with that kind of formation, but now actually why the falling into the kind of negation, because nation state is kind of negation.
Well, I see the negation from both sides. I don't see that like this negation only comes from Iranian government or regime. It's also coming from outside, from the global economy,
course, yes.
like
imposing a lot
dialectic. Definitely. I mean, imposing,
yeah.
just look at the sanctions, how they're working, how they are functioning, like the sanctions like unfairly imposed on Iranian, like of course it makes the nation states, actually it feeds the nation state, it nourishes the nation state, yeah. But like I try to formulate my last question in terms of this political spirituality thing, which I think, I mean, given that political spirituality is not something religious, it is not something theological, it's something more collective, or as you even said, quoting Foucault, it is some kind of collective fearlessness in terms of, revolution.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you still see that in Iran?
That's possible.
I mean, like, I'm asking you. I mean, of course, I can answer that from.
Well, you are here.
Yeah, so, I mean, like, no, because like in the article, I mean, talking about Iranian revolution, you don't really only focus on the moment of revolution. You're also talking about the decades of the revolution. You're talking about the Ahmad from before revolution to Soroush, to other scholars after revolution. So there is some implication for me that you are appreciating something Iranian politics in terms of international geopolitics. Is it true?
I think I'm not interested in that kind of geopolitics. I'm interested in the geophilosophy. So but actually, if we don't have this pandemic, I would have been Iran, for checking out this situation. I didn't go because very interesting. 2019, the relationship between the Korea and the Iran is restored, so we can travel, to Iran, legally. That's why I plan to actually go to Iran. But because of the pandemic, it's all stopped. But actually, I tried to check out and anyway, University of Tehran, and then even actually the publication, which published within Iran. But actually, as you know that the much of state philosophy, I found that very disappointed the stuff about the state philosophy. That means they try to reproduce that kind of state ideology, you know, not really actually, as you said, is a fearless speech, you know, against the kind of problem. But another actually the interesting thing, I already invited, you know, one of your the resisting poet is I invited you know, Iranian poet is several, when is that? It's 3 years ago.
Okay.
So we had a World Literature Festival, something like that. So I was a part of an organization.
Oh.
So I recommended him, and then he actually came to Seoul, and he is a very actually interesting poet. But of course, he is an old generation. So that was actually the first time actually. Of course, I read Foucault, and then also I had this curiosity long time ago. But that was the first time I encountered, you know, the Iran as a kind of reality. He told me lots of story, you know, the behind. But he still had, you know, even he's a established poet, you know, but he's a kind of resistance, you know, the Iranian government. But he still had a kind of passion, you know, passion changed the world. He tried to participate in the, you know, the world in actually the, you know, affair, not rather, you know, that kind of nation state something, but because he's a poet, you know, he's an international poet because of that. So I think that is, in my opinion, very important, you know. As far as I actually understand, what Foucault tried to say in terms of political spirituality was, as you said, a fearlessness. Fearlessness for what? Speech. You know, he believed in that kind of, you know, the fearless speech, power of fearless speech. There is a expression. You need to actually express you, not freely, but, you know, fearlessly. So I think it should, of course, the generation changed, you know, as you said, you know, and then I agree that even actually in Korea, you know, my generation already corrupted, you know, and then already part of this regime, you know, but what actually they losing is that the idea of a revolution, you know. And how can we preserve this idea of revolution? Okay, just art and then literature would preserve the sensation of that kind of revolution. But how can we actually reserve this, you know, idea, philosophy? That's why actually I decided to study in a philosophy. So, in my opinion, okay, lots of people believe the art and literature, and then this, you know, the regime will be a more liberal and open, you know, to you know, the foreigners or differences. But in my opinion, rather than, you know, the literature or the art, the philosophy is more international, more actually the open space, in my opinion, because this is a kind of, you know, the place for the ideas, competition of ideas possible, and different ideas came together in philosophy. We can actually bring in the different philosopher, and even, you know, Heidegger can be used by Iranian, you know, the actual revolutionary in different way. You know, that is exactly what Deleuze, you know, talked about. You know, what is that when he you know, made this concept, minor use of language or minor use of literature or geophilosophy. Geophilosophy means the minor use of European philosophy, and then Iranian revolution would be one of the example. They actually use or misuse the Heidegger. You know,
Yeah.
even actually the Foucault, okay, misused the Iranian revolution, but he made this actually concept. That is philosophy, in my opinion. And then this actually misunderstanding would, you know, let us, you know, the actual kind of peerless speech, you know, courage.
Yeah, although sometimes this misunderstanding has consequences, you know, like
Yeah, this is exactly a different the position, you know, against analytic philosophy. You know,
yeah, definitely,
positive, you know, positivism.
definitely, yeah,
The
exactly,
dominant,
yeah,
yeah,
and
in Foucauldian sense, economic, you know, the political economy is definitely from, you know, that kind of,
sure.
you know, different position. The misunderstanding.
Alex, that was a wonderful talk. I mean, I really enjoyed. And
I'm very pleased and very happy to talk to
I
you.